Hello friends, I am Abhay Kumar and right now I am sitting in JNU at the Center of Arts and Aesthetics, and with me is Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury, who teaches at Arts and Aesthetics Center, and he has been deeply engaging with Ambedkar thought. He has seen the campus JNU for many decades, and with the passage of the time, Ambedkar's thought has been taken up by intellectuals and students here very seriously. So Baba Sahab Ambedkar's birth anniversary is going to be celebrated in a few days. So using this occasion, we are going to discuss the key ideas of Baba Sahab Ambedkar and how Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury has got interested into the political thought of Ambedkar. Sir, thank you very much. As a student of history, my first questions would be that you have been at JNU for many years, for many decades. You have seen how the political language of this campus changing. So, will you be able to tell any particular movement or a particular time frame where Ambedkar was taken seriously by JNU intellectuals? Because generally it is being believed that JNU is red, JNU is largely left dominated, and it did not pay attention to Ambedkar's thought earlier as he should have been given.
Um, on the one hand, it is correct that in our, MA days and even research days, MPhil and PhD, 1990s, we were not really reading Baba Saheb Ambedkar um, in the same way that we are reading, many other things. That is absolutely correct. Though it's not true that no one was interested in Ambedkar, that is not true at all. I remember discussions with some people, individuals and groups on, for instance, Dalit literature. So people in literary studies, I remember Hindi literature students were talking about, though I was myself in sort of English literature I was doing, but I had discussions with some students of Hindi literature who were already interested in Dalit Sahitya, Dalit literature. And that obviously wouldn't be possible without some kind of reflection and thinking that's coming from Ambedkar. But you're right. This wouldn't be called a movement in the sense of an autonomous Ambedkar or even the Dalit movement at that time. In the same way that a certain kind of Marxism and organized left movement did exist in a very remarkably strong and important way. Since then, not just then, even now, it carries on. At the same time, one will have to say that the people who were interested or starting to get interested in Ambedkar were mostly from the left or were associated with the left. At what capacity? I mean, there could be, some of them were part of organizations, some were not. But it was a certain interest which, could be identified with the left identity, but I think more importantly that concern with equality, with justice, with end of exploitation, all of that was leading people to look at, apart from Marx and the well-known thinkers within Marxism, whether Indian or outside India, that very search for these essential fundamental human values and how to realize them in society was leading a lot of them to Ambedkar. But you are right, this was not an autonomous Ambedkarite or even a Dalit movement, and to that extent even within the campus I don't remember at that time in the 90s, that I don't remember that there were any organizations, autonomous students organizations at that time with a strong Ambedkarite set of ideas or linked to the Dalit movement, which already, I mean, it's not as if the Dalit movement didn't exist across India, from Dalit Panthers, which was from the 1960s at least. So JNU was late. I have to, I mean, definitely you're right there. That changed. I mean, but the other part of my life in JNU, since I started teaching, in a somewhat sort of provisional way in early 2000s, now in a permanent capacity, but from early 2000 to now, I have seen the formation of an autonomous, relatively organized, and also with a relative mass base Dalit movement, students movement, that is, form in JNU. So yes, these are, I suppose, the basic facts that I can attest to.
Sir, many Dalit activists they claim and they allege also that Ambedkar was not read, he was ignored because the compositions of JNU was very different earlier, and once that compositions started changing and more Dalits and Bahujans started coming to this university, I think Savarna professors were forced to take up Ambedkar. How far do you think that this claim or this allegation is correct?
Claim, allegation, whatever word one uses, and both words have their pertinence, no doubt. It's a reasonable hypothesis. I don't know how to confirm it or refute it, and I'm not even trying to do that. I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that Savarna professors who resisted Ambedkar, or, well, I would put it this way, who almost disavowed, or even they were unconscious. I mean, they knew about Ambedkar, and that would include me, surely. I definitely don't exclude myself from this trend. They knew about Ambedkar, but in a sort of unconscious way. They were not really thinking about Ambedkar in the sense that intellectuals are meant to be conscious of the things they are thinking about, the thinking process. Ambedkar, you're right, Ambedkar was not part of that conscious thinking process in JNU, while JNU was definitely one of the leading intellectual centers of the country, has been so. So yes, that is true. The reason for that, in the first place, yes, clearly a certain kind of dominant caste composition of the teaching strata. I always hesitate to call it community, the teaching strata. In the same way that I hesitate calling students immediately a community, but the different strata of students and the change of composition. Now, the change of composition in students is a complicated matter, because we have to see that even within the earlier students movement, which was a very strong one in JNU and indeed led by the left, there was a consciousness about about intervening and making the composition more just, and not being entirely dominated by the hegemony of certain elite classes. How that elitism was interpreted, yes, I mean, on that we can have a very important and relevant discussion, whether caste hegemony and Brahminism was thought of as, it was always thought of as there, but was it thought of as one of the key reasons and key forces in that elite hegemony? That, yes, that has now come to a lot more into Savarna consciousness. It was suppressed or disavowed, or, like I said, simply relatively Savarna professors were upper caste strata was willfully unconscious, though not unaware. So to that extent, yes, it is true that there is a pressure today, which intellectual consciousness of upper caste strata, including in JNU, have to respond to, and in a sense, it makes them take, say, Ambedkar as the leading thinker, who has been relatively in obscurity till some years back, to be brought into the picture. So yes, that is correct, indeed correct. But at the same time, we have to be careful in analyzing this phenomenon insofar as it is something which still belongs to the relatively fundamental, even generic, universal search for certain values which one is committed to, and in JNU there has been an exemplary commitment to those values, which include Ambedkarite values of equality and justice among other things, and collective happiness, I would say. So yes, that would be my answer.
Friends, if you come to JNU campus, Professor Choudhury would be the first person, or maybe among the few professors who had been liked by Bahujan students in a big way. And if there is any crisis, and if any JNU faculty or member is not willing to stand with the students who are being persecuted by the administration, Professor Choudhury will stand and he will speak firmly. So, sir, you are respected a lot among Ambedkarite students. So, what was the moment when you became interested and you thought that here is a person, Bhimrao Ambedkar, whose writing should be taken seriously? What was the turning point in your life?
Well, first of all, though what you're saying is very kind of you, but I wouldn't like to single myself out at all. Even as someone from an upper caste background, as so to speak, so-called being I don't know what to say, liked, approved. At the most, I can say, in a political sense, in the sense of a collective solidarity, yes, there is a certain solidarity which I would like to express with groups which are, really committed to struggling and fighting for justice and wrongs, and that yes. But then, like I said, I would like to state it in the most unconditional, universal fashion. Whether I'm able to myself consistently commit to that in my own life and work, that is up to the others to judge. But I wouldn't like to single myself out at all. No. Anyway, so irrespective of that. My own, well, it's a very factual question, really. My own reading of Ambedkar indeed started much later than I would have, in retrospect, liked it to have started. I wish it had started much earlier. But it did start in a very specific way, because I was, working on several things, including something like the relationship between the overall idea of sovereign power and state sovereignty in relation to specific modes of both government and popular revolution. So revolution, government, and the larger framework of sovereignty. I was working on something like that in a sort of both historical and philosophical way, and I was actually working on, and which is in a sense my whatever little specialization I have in relation to European history, European philosophy. There I was looking at French Revolution, but at some point I read and I realized that among the non-Europeans who were responding to the who responded to the French Revolution extremely passionately and extremely rigorously, one of such people was Babasaheb Ambedkar. And I read him in that light in the first place, particularly his Mahad speech, which actually I have written about at length in my own works. But initially it was in the light of French Revolution, and that's why I have in my own work called Ambedkar a Europeanist, as different from being Eurocentric. I don't want to go into the details of that, but for me it is a real moment of finding a great Europeanist among the so to speak Indian intellectual classes, and an intellectual who, like you pointed out earlier, who has been relatively obscured, marginalized, yet one of the greatest figures in the Indian intellectual landscape, Ambedkar. So that is one. The other reason why I got interested in Ambedkar was, of course, to do with social inequality, in particularly in relation to caste. Again, caste was a kind of unconscious reality in one's life. Living in India, it was there at every moment in one's life, and yet one was not really consciously thinking of it in the mode of a critique. And at some point, again, I encountered this much later than I would have, in retrospect, liked to have happened. I started reading about caste in relation to the other kind of side of caste, upper caste thinking, the structures of upper caste consciousness, and a particular idea in upper caste consciousness, which is the idea of debt, rin, what in India is called rina. So I found the paradoxical theory in certain strands of, well, so to speak, Hindu philosophy, that the upper caste actually has a greater rina, greater like guru rina, pitri rina, which can be correlated also to the story of Eklavya, who was excluded from that rina, guru rina, and yet that rina, that debt, is actually power. So this paradox, apparent paradox of being in higher debt, and yet that very debt entailing hegemony, social power. Through that angle of debt, I actually entered my whatever little study of caste that I have conducted. So these are the basic starting points.
Sir, Ambedkar's birth anniversary is being celebrated, and now everybody is claiming to be Ambedkarite. So, how do you see this movement when Ambedkar is being appropriated? So,
well, the question of appropriation is always double-edged. On the one hand, yes, the very act of appropriation, the very sort of sound of that term, which is corrosive and negative, clearly means that the essence, the truth of the thinker is somewhere getting, if not merely totally falsified, definitely restricted and manipulated, engineered for certain interests, whether it's upper caste or state interests or whichever other interests. On the other hand, the very need to appropriate arises from a certain success or a certain reality of the force of that thought. This has been true of not just Ambedkar, but several such, pioneering thinkers, that they have been appropriated, but that appropriation has also been forced upon those who appropriate that thought. In any case, I mean, this is the logic of what we call the mainstream. On the one hand, we rightly want to bring marginal thinking, thinking that comes from the subaltern side of society, and which is suppressed and so on and so forth, ignored for thousands of years sometimes, into the mainstream light. On the other hand, the mainstream also has its own demand. So you kind of make the great thinker, who is fundamentally a dissenter, a rebel, at least partly say apparently the very things the mainstream wants him or her to say. This has been a deal world over. You can take anybody, any example. Doesn't matter, Buddha, Marx, Ambedkar. Each of them have been partly made to say what the mainstream wants them to say. And at the same time, the fact that the mainstream has had to take cognizance, or has had to record the existence of their thinking, is testimony to the power and the efficacy, political efficacy of their thinking. This applies to Ambedkar too.
sir, do we have as true followers of Baba Sahib Ambedkar any means, any strategy to counter that appropriation?
No, that's what I'm saying. There's a word, again, it's from the left tradition, Gramsci and so on, called hegemony, counter-hegemony. So one of the related but sort of counter terms to appropriation, which is a kind of hegemony surely, is counter-hegemony. So when someone appropriates Ambedkar, then in a way the appropriator must be appropriated by Ambedkar or Ambedkarite thinking. We have to be careful here. It's one thing to say that Ambedkar today is the is the subject or the object rather of a kind of, I don't know what to call it, it's kind of visual, a kind of visual image centric appropriation. His identity, his picture, his statue, which itself is testament to a kind of presence, an iconographic presence, a kind of iconocracy of Ambedkar has an iconocratic power today, which itself comes from the Ambedkarite movement, surely. At the same time, any such appropriation is indeed also a kind of fixatedness, which takes away from the dynamism of any thinking. So that is the the two sides, the two. So one of the answers to your question is appropriation as something to be counter appropriated. And the other one is more radical, yes, you're right, which is to refuse appropriation. To, in a sense, say, which a lot of them, Bahujan Dalit intellectuals do say with a lot of force, that refuse that temptation to mainstream Ambedkar, and in a sense almost announce Ambedkar as a very specific minoritarian thinker, which I think is a very meaningful position, with the qualification that even here it should not become the so-called personal identity of Ambedkar, which is the object of this kind, or subject of this sort of a conscious minoritarian position. Because the moment you make Ambedkar, so to speak, an identity subject, that identity is because he's not here. We are here. So, like it or not, that subject will not remain dynamic. It will become like a fixed object. Even Ambedkar, even within Dalit thinking, will become a fixed object, and that is not surely what anybody wants. So, to that extent, the real question is what one could call Ambedkar's thinking, or if you want a slight twist to that word, Ambedkar thought, whatever that might be. It is we have no choice but to speak in our own voices, whether it's upper caste appropriation or Dalit thinking. It has to be in our own voices. It cannot be the repetition of Ambedkar without the actual singularity of Ambedkar's own, because we can read him. He cannot think for us. So that we have to be very, very clear about, it seems to me.
Sir, be it JNU or national politics, there are three key players. One is Hindu right, the second is Dalit Bahujan, and third is Marxist group. So I am going to take three issues which is related to Ambedkar. Let me first begin with the right-wing claim. The right-wing claim is, or the right-wing projections of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is a great Hindu, he is a great Hindu reformer, and he protected Hindu identity, he was a nationalist, and somehow Ambedkar is projected as a fighter against, let's say, Muslim supremacy or Islamic supremacy. So how do you look at such kind of propaganda, being a Ambedkarite scholar or being a scholar who has been reading Ambedkar for a long time?
See, again, these things have to be done both modestly and at the same time robustly. Reading Ambedkar is the only way to go about learning about the truth of Ambedkar, both reading his texts as well as reading the historical contexts in which these texts and Ambedkar's own life unfolded. And if you do that, then you will see that much of this propaganda is indeed propaganda in the worst sense, which is that it is based on falsification, distortion, invention, pure fiction, fantasy. And I mean, there's so many. At the same time, if we don't have the time for that sort of a detailed discussion, this can also be demonstrated vis-a-vis each text that Ambedkar wrote. Think this Muslim, anti-Muslim, total falsehood, complete, I won't say distortion, absolutely, it has no basis at all, is actually built on a deliberate misreading, or equally possible, incompetent reading of Ambedkar's certain text, the partition-related text. If you read that text, you will see what is going on. Ambedkar says, when it comes to fundamental, long-duration, inter-community, inter-religious, inter-identity strife and, hostility, no one comes looking out good in history. No one. Not a single identity looks coming out good. Doesn't matter which identity, what name you take, Hindu, Muslim, Jew, anybody, no one comes looking out good. So to that extent, we can't be romantic about that sort of communitarian identity of any sort. And so if it's a question of something like, say, the question of partition, then one has to do it on the basis of that historical moment, which in Ambedkar's case was in the 1940s, and then analyze it dispassionately. Are we capable of that sort of dispassionate, at the same time, extremely sensitive analysis to history? That is the question, to put to propaganda of any sort. So, yeah.
Sir, my friends who are on the side of the left, they call themselves radical left. When we engage with any discussion with them, they argue that it's good that you are reading Ambedkar, but also keep in mind that Ambedkar's politics, Ambedkar's thought will not go far away from a society where identity, the marginalized identity, will be accommodated at public places, or exploitations can be democratized in a sense that today safai karamchari or sanitation workers are from particular caste, and if Ambedkar's ideologies are implemented, then what will happen, that people belonging to different caste will become, let's say, safai karamchari will become, let's say, sanitation workers. So exploitation will be democratized. It has not got really fundamental emancipatory project. So how far do you think that such a reading of Ambedkar is valid?
No, that is not a valid reading at all. If that is what you mean by a leftist or whatever reading from the left, then that is not a valid reading. I mean, it's really, I don't know what to say. If that is the reading, then it's a very poor reading. But I don't think the so-called reading on the left is limited to this sort of pretty absurd reading. I'm sure that there are intellectuals on the left who are left. I mean, in that sense, they are not really part of the autonomous Ambedkar movement, whose reading is far more incisive, even if it's critical. So anyway, that is, we don't have the time to go into those details. But on this question of, the example of Safai Karmachari is absolutely very important in a sense. So Ambedkar had this specific, in Annihilation of Caste, he had this specific diagnosis vis-a-vis both the axiom or the principle of capitalism, free market, and how caste blocks it. So the free market apparently is based on the ideal. I mean, in actual practice, it never happens like that, but the ideal of free mobility of labor. Because labor, which is proletarized, has only its labor power to sell. So free mobility depending on the law of the market. But Ambedkar pointed out that caste is what blocks free mobility. So he famously said that caste is a division of laborers and not division of labor. So there is a specific scientific sociological point here, which nobody in their right mind would deny in real caste society. Yeah, absolutely. Now the question is how to overcome it. How to overcome it. Yeah, in terms of programmatic political action, organizational action. That is the question for both the left, if the left is interested in doing both things. So, I mean, this is a question for the left, both also vis-a-vis the other debate about feudalism, because there are feudal remnants in every society, including in India. That do we first want a kind of democratic bourgeois revolution before the, so to speak, the second revolution, which changes the very order of private capitalist society into something else. So in doing that, should we first have bourgeois revolution? So if you're saying that Ambedkar is a bourgeois thinker who is only interested in a bourgeois revolution, then yes, then you can say that he is not really, or his thinking is not really a thinking fundamentally interested in the end of exploitation. Is only interested in the securing of the ideal in society of free mobility of labor. But that is not correct. That is not correct, because you can read in Ambedkar. How can you say Ambedkar is a consistent thinker of the free capital if he is one person who is asking for the nationalization of so many things, including of land, the state ownership? In that sense, he is a kind of 20th century socialist in specific matters, in policy matters of certain kinds. So it's a complicated question. To answer it, which side are you on, is really meaningless for me. Really meaningless. It doesn't help anybody.
Sir, some Ambedkarite scholars, they argue, maybe activists, they say that class is not relevant. Only caste is the Indian reality, And even I know a person who is well-known columnist. I think he was a student in JNU some 20 years ago. He keeps writing in newspaper, and he says that Ambedkar was champion of capitalism, and he was for the free market. So my question is that what is your take on a section of Ambedkarites who say that Ambedkar has nothing to do with class politics?
No, but see, I am not entering into any polemics with anybody. I am not here to take a side on this camp or that. That is not my interest. That is not. I am not doing anything important here. I mean, people who take sides should also, and surely many of them are doing important things, even if those things are, things to be looked at very doubtfully, including maybe in the right. I don't know, on the right. At least they're making important interventions. I don't have any claims to that kind of thing. What I can do within my limitations is to read Ambedkar and also read Ambedkar and also general history, Indian history and other kinds of, historical strands of thinking and so on, as carefully as possible. In my reading, there is no way I can accept or be convinced that Ambedkar is a champion of the free market. I said this very clearly. Ambedkar, which is not so far away from certain strategies of socialist, 20th century socialist thinking, that how does one achieve the so-called threshold of a socialist revolution? Does one first somehow be able to reach the threshold of a kind of true bourgeois society? Does that make those socialist thinkers bourgeois thinkers? Maybe the strategy is to be criticized, which some other socialist camps have done. Ambedkar similarly, though in a different different site of thought, says that caste blocks even the ideals, the realization of the ideals of the free market. Does that make him someone who praises those ideals? This is not a legitimate conclusion. This is not a legitimate inference. This is the point. There is no problem if certain thinkers, whether Ambedkarite or Dalit or whatever persuasion they are part of, speak in their own voices and say, we think free market can partly emancipate or even totally ameliorate the miseries and the injustices of the erstwhile untouchable castes and the general Shudra question and so on and so forth. Now, if one says that in one's own voice, then one can argue with those voices. But to say that Ambedkar is saying this, I don't know what to do with that because I am also reading the same texts that the other one is reading. Then at the most we can do is to discuss those texts line by line with as much objectivity as possible. That's all what I can say.
Sir, the concluding remarks, you have said many things about Dr. Ambedkar, and if I try to request you to summarize it by posing this question, why Ambedkar is still relevant and why should he be taken more seriously?
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Ambedkar is relevant first because any thinker who pursues in his or her own time universal, unconditional, emancipatory values is always relevant. His thinking, I've used this figure of speech in my book, he's immortal. That doesn't make the historical person immortal. So we must not confuse one immortality with another. Ambedkar once said that don't pray for my soul because I have no soul. So in that sense, he is a man of exemplary courage who faces his mortality. And within that horizon of mortality, he is working relentlessly. Yeah, inexhaustible, even when life will eventually be exhausted. That is Ambedkar's existential heroism of the kind which should not be made into what Ambedkar himself called, do not bring bhakti into politics. But at the same time, there is absolute reason to be totally committed to the truths of that endless labor within a mortal life. That's the first point. a kind of existential lesson. And the second is a political point, which is that any thinker with that kind of, and I mean, Ambedkar is one example, we could take others, with that sort of a specific but universal intervention in history, will also always ask for, demand a certain kind of new historical realization, new historical communities to and subjects and political forms to relive, recommence, reactualize those ideas in new contexts. And that is our job. And that is the job of, and that has been the job of an autonomous Dalit movement. Autonomous does not mean isolated. Autonomous does not mean cut off. Autonomous simply means that it has a certain singularity. It has a certain kind of, it takes responsibility. Ambedkar once differentiated between responsibility and merely following habits. So an autonomous movement takes responsibility for its own steps and principles. So in a sense, that is the ethical, that is the political and ethical lesson in Ambedkar. And then finally, in Ambedkar, in that sense, his Buddhism is actually very important. In Ambedkar, there is a great intellectual commitment and faith, it seems to me, in a certain kind of universal capacity for human reason, despite particular actions which are so irrational and so blind and so frustrating, which in our times, it seems to me, we are continuously experiencing, which is blind, stupid, frustrating. But Ambedkar nevertheless committed himself to a certain capacity of reasoning, of public reasoning, which is a kind of what I call public intellectuality. And that public intellectuality, it seems to me, towards the end of his life, he wanted to recuperate in Buddhism. So again, that brings us to what I'll call the dispositional lesson that Ambedkar seems to have left for us. The disposition to treat the other and be with the other in the mode of an equal life. Whether that happens under the sign of Buddhism or not is a secondary question. With Ambedkar, in a sense, it was almost newly invented under the sign of one of the old great teachings, that of Buddha. So that would be my closing statement.
Friends, Professor Choudhury has taught us that Dr. Ambedkar's the key idea is that our struggle for emancipation should continue, and that is why Ambedkar may be mortal as a physical body, but his idea is immortal because he stood for emancipation. And in today's time, the politics which is rising is counter-revolutionary. That is why Ambedkar is more relevant today. Professor Choudhury, thank you very much for
Exactly, yeah, I agree with you totally. Thank you.